Okay, we are recording.
Well,
All right, thanks everyone for joining to our UC ANR Water webinar series. And today's speaker is Angel Fernandez Bou, who is a researcher in the Water Systems Management Lab at UC Merced. Angel works on a range of topics, including multidisciplinary projects to preserve resources and habitat for society and nature. His focus is on finding solutions for biosystems challenges that requires combinations of engineering, environmental, and socioeconomic approaches. I am proud to say that Angel is a PhD, newly minted rather, right? 6 months ago, right?
last year.
From UC Merced, and he holds a MSc in biosystems engineering from Brazil and an engineering degree in agriculture from Spain. So we are delighted to have you, Angel. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Safik and Ellen, for the invite, and thank you everyone for attending the talk. I hope everyone is doing well, you and your families, and you are taking care of yourselves and your mental health and your physical health. Today I'm going to talk about two topics. A recent article that we have published called A Glass Half Empty, that talks about groundwater and Sigma representation in newspapers in California. And then I'm going to talk about our research with vulnerable communities in the Central Valley. Maybe I haven't had the pleasure to meet all of you, then I would like to introduce myself a little bit and give some background about how I arrived at the work that I'm currently doing. My background, as Safik was saying, is in engineering, originally agricultural engineering, but I transitioned to a broader environmental engineering when I had the opportunity. So I did my master's in biosystems engineering with focus in water resources. And in Brazil, I conducted research in wastewater and landfill leachate treatment and river flow modeling for flood forecasting and for hydropower trading optimization. And then I moved to the US and I did my PhD in environmental systems at UC Merced, very proudly, and with focus in CO2 emissions from tropical forests. And I worked in an amazing project featuring leafcutter ants that are the greatest herbivore in tropical forests. And I had the opportunity to create even my own sensors, my own CO2 measuring devices. And we had a couple of covers for our publications. And here in this picture, you can see me digging in a hole in Costa Rica, trying to find different chambers or in a massive nest of leafcutter ants, trying to define the fluid dynamics of CO2 moving and exiting and emissions in the nest. In 2016, a few months after I arrived in California, along with some friends, we started doing workshops with children, and many students were kids from migrant families. And some of them didn't even speak English. They expected us to be role models for them. So we started giving workshops about advanced scientific topics, robotics, ecology, archaeology, bioengineering. And that was very fun. So everything was hands-on and the kids really, really loved it. And that was my first real contact with the inequities that exist in California, because many of those kids came from vulnerable communities. Their parents were often farm workers, and some of them have to move around looking for work. And the kids didn't even have a fixed school to attend. And some of those kids were brilliant, just super smart, but it's difficult for them if they don't have the same opportunities. And in fact, we have continued doing this work with this nonprofit organization we created at UC Merced called Forvenir. But this first contact with vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities, was very important for me. I decided I wanted to work towards improving equity in California. And one of my actions is to volunteer in my free time for the Union of Concerned Scientists in the Groundwater Technical Assistance Network. Basically, we provide technical advice for nonprofits and stakeholders involved with Sigma and groundwater sustainability in general. And we normally work with the smallest or less powerful stakeholders such as vulnerable communities or disadvantaged communities. But I guess even more relevant is when I graduated, I graduated last year, and I had the opportunity to work as a researcher with diverse stakeholders addressing water and environmental issues in California. And Professor Josué Medellin invited me to work with him at his newly created Water Systems Management Lab at UC Merced. And many of you probably know Josué. He's a fantastic researcher, an even better boss. And we have a wonderful team in our lab. At my position, I was able to focus on how to include disadvantaged communities in our research in California. So, we study this water and natural resources allocation based on socioeconomic and environmental constraints, but we use large scale models when the size of the community sometimes is very small. So it's very challenging, and I will talk about that later because, as I said before, today I'm going to divide my presentation into parts. The first I'm going to talk is about this paper that we recently published in the Science of the Total Environment, led by Dr. Lee Bernacki, titled "A Glass Half Empty, Limited Voices, Limited Groundwater for California." We basically analyze the role of newspaper media in Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, and how the different stakeholders are represented in the media that informs California. And in the second part, I will talk about disadvantaged communities, as I said, in the Central Valley. And you probably have seen this many times before, but I just want to remind you that these are the disadvantaged community places in the Central Valley. There is about 2.1 million people living in disadvantaged communities in the Central Valley. There are about 10 million people living in disadvantaged communities in California. So I'm going to talk about the representation of disadvantaged communities of California in scientific publications, newspaper news, and in legislation bills. And I will also show a guide that we have created that was recently published by the Union of Concerned Scientists about how disadvantaged communities can take action against climate change effects and how they can advocate for their own fundamental rights. Well, my work is supported by several projects. Thank you to all the sponsors, NSF, USDA, the California Strategic Growth Council, and UC Merced. I'm happy to say that I work in one of them with Safik. And thank you to all the PIs, of course. As I said, the first part of the talk is based on this publication, A Glass Half Empty. And when we think about how to have an effective management of groundwater, we need to think about stakeholders and how they are engaged and understand what's going on. And so there is a good base to create solutions, right? But representation must be even among the stakeholders. So our study analyzes the representation of stakeholders and solutions that allows us to define 5 goals. So the first one is reach stakeholders for engagement and participation in groundwater sustainability plans. Then the representation of SGMA in the media, improve public understanding of groundwater, identifying representation bottlenecks, and finding new solutions for SGMA. But how do you reach stakeholders for engagement and participation in GSPs? It's not easy, especially some stakeholders are very difficult to reach, for example, small Latino communities. And groundwater is a common pool resource, therefore everyone should be a stakeholder. But I think about this, right? What about US consumers that consume California products, but they live out of the state of California, for example, in the East Coast, or international consumers of tree nuts, or worldwide downstream users of California products that do not live in California? Those products depend on California water, but these people don't live in California. Are their interests more important than the interests from those living in California, from the environment of California? It's not an easy question because you have a trade-off between economy and environment and vulnerable people. And how do people learn about this and about legislation and about public participation? Well, they normally use news, media, social media, contact with other people, but newspapers are traditionally more influential and in how people respect them and trust their reputation. And there is also other sources for this public participation, the scholarship about Sigma, with the studies that were conducted based on what happened before, during, and after the implementation of Sigma. And how Sigma is depicted by the media. So to analyze representation, we perform a qualitative and quantitative analysis of 365 newspaper articles. We focused on identifying the stakeholders represented in Sigma-related news, also the solutions and their co-occurrence. And then we analyzed the meaning of those results. All the newspaper news from 2014 to 2019 belong to either the San Joaquin Valley, the Tulare Basin, or to urban areas. And here in the map, you can see in blue, in blue circles are the urban areas. The San Joaquin Basin is depicted in orange in the north, and the Tulare Basin is in yellow in the south. And you can also see how most of the San Joaquin and the Tulare Basins are critically overdrafted. And these are the results for representation of stakeholders. So in the figure, each bar represents a stakeholder and each color represents a region. Urban areas in blue, in the bottom, you can see that is the most homogeneous across stakeholder representation. San Joaquin is on top, is orange. It's also relatively homogeneous. No, it's more or less the same amount of articles to each stakeholder. And Tulare in yellow, in between them, is the least homogeneous. Tulare drives this difference in the bar size, with about 20 times more articles talking about agriculture or talking about policymakers than articles talking about academic stakeholders, for example. And by the way, urban coverage tended to point to the Tulare region as the epicenter of Sigma activity. And in fact, Tulare is the region with the most number of articles about Sigma. And these are the results for the solutions. Also, each solution is one bar, and they are less homogeneous than the stakeholders. The largest number of articles was for supply solutions that were mainly focused on importing water from one area to another through legal or physical means. And Tulare had many results about expanding existing infrastructure or adding new supply. For example, infrastructure is a solution that occurred in 1/3 of all Tulare region articles. And the word canal was the third most frequent word in the infrastructure coding in our analysis. And this table shows the comparison between regions for the expected number of solutions and stakeholders per article. So it's basically how many stakeholders and how many solutions are mentioned per article, per region. And you can see we used a linear mixed model to perform this analysis, and you can see how urban and San Joaquin are not significantly different in their way to represent the stakeholders and solutions, but Tulare is different. And this is a cross-tab analysis of the solutions and the stakeholders co-occurring in publications. It shows number of publications per solution and for each stakeholder. So each graph is one stakeholder, each of the bars represents one solution. So for example, supply and demand solutions that are blue, light blue and dark blue co-occur with agriculture stakeholder, and agriculture is the stakeholder with most articles. You can also see the number is the greatest. But they also, supply and demand can also occur with water manager and city and policymakers. And regulator and academic are the stakeholders with fewest number or the lowest number of articles. And we also perform a cluster analysis of with the solutions and the stakeholders to see how they co-occur. And this analysis involves a reduction of dimensionality using principal component analysis. And you can see that these two dimensions represent very well what's going on. It's almost 80 something % of the total variability of the system. The stakeholder, policymaker, and agricultural industry, and the solution supply are grouped in the same cluster. And this supports our analysis that water supply is a popular solution with the stakeholders who also support agriculture and policymakers. This is a kernel density estimate. And here we can see how often several stakeholders concurred with several solutions, right? So the farther from 0, 0, the more holistic the approach of the newspaper article is. And urban had the most holistic approach, normally including more stakeholders than the San Joaquin region and many more than the Tulare Basin or the Tulare region. The diversity of representation, in this case, contributes to a broader coverage. Then these results suggest that media coverage does not address water as a system. It addresses it through specific topics, not in a very holistic way that would be helpful to understand better the system. Then how can we use this information to improve the public understanding of groundwater? Well, groundwater itself is very challenging. It's a barrier, and it's very complex in its nature. So we cannot see what's going on in the soil, but we need to talk more about it. We need to explain it more clearly so people understand better the connection between surface water and groundwater and the whole water cycle. So water is essential, and we need to treat it as essential. And not only the newspapers are important, also scientists and other stakeholders need to do their part in this, our part. So that guide, for example, about groundwater is a very good example that was published by the Union of Concerned Scientists a couple of years ago and was very popular. We also need to identify representation bottlenecks. And maybe you have seen this cartoon already. We need to be aware of our biases and address other stakeholders' biases, especially biases in communications, because sometimes those biases are motivated by political or socioeconomic positions, but other times those biases are due to a lack of knowledge or information. So as scientists, we need to educate so common interests are understood by everyone. And again, groundwater is difficult to understand, that's a bottleneck, but it's a common resource. So all the stakeholders involved must be well represented in decisions related to it. And finally, of course, reducing inequity and inequality is a way to increase participation of more diverse stakeholders. So what is for the future? Finding new solutions for SGMA. Well, we have plenty of space for improvement in SGMA. SGMA is a good step in the correct direction, but it still needs to improve communication and outreach, improve social and environmental justice. This is reducing inequality and inequity, and of course, improving representation. And well, this is the end of my first part. Now I am going to continue shifting to disadvantaged communities. I don't know, Safik, do you want to do some questions now, or do you prefer to wait until the end?
Yeah, we only have one question right now, but perhaps we can wait until the end.
Sure.
So I can read it out.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk about disadvantaged communities. And as I was saying, I started working with disadvantaged communities to include them in our models. Our team studied water and natural resources allocation. And, you know, we use large scale models when many communities are very small in size. So I started working on this. I attended conferences, events, symposiums about climate change, about water resources, about environment. I heard many experts talking about fascinating topics of, climate forecasting, water management, uncertainty, robustness, resilience. And many times they would say at the end of their talks, and we need to include disadvantaged communities in our research. It's very important. We need to include disadvantaged communities. So I would go to them and I would ask, oh, how do you include disadvantaged communities in your research? And they said, well, I don't know, but we need to do it. And it was frustrating. So it was frustrating because it's something that it looks like everyone knows that we have to do, but no one knows how to do it, right? And it was frustrating, but it was also challenging, because thanks to that, I started digging and learning more about the communities. And by then I met my colleague, my friend, Pablo Ortiz Partida from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who was in a similar position and who had the similar background, similar doubts, and we decided to join efforts. And we decided that we had to visit the communities and we needed to learn from the literature how to include those communities in a practical way in our research. And we made a plan. And our work with disadvantaged communities has three main objectives. First, giving advice to the communities. Second, amplifying their voices and empower them as the stakeholders. And third, creating multi-benefit frameworks. So to give advice, we wanted to write a guide for the communities to adapt to climate change and other challenges they may face. And this is the guide that was published a couple, 3 weeks ago by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I will talk a little bit about it later. To amplify voices, we are working on portraying the representation that communities have across publishing platforms. And we will publish also the main results of our interviews. And to create multi-benefit scenarios, we are studying the impacts of agricultural changes near communities. And we are doing this sensitivity analysis accounting for different scenarios of potential alternatives to repurpose land near disadvantaged communities. So the objective is to create a framework that is good for everyone. And today I'm going to talk about our work on perception of disadvantaged communities, and later I will talk a little bit about the guide. But before I continue, I would like to acknowledge the fantastic work done by many social scientists with disadvantaged communities. So we are not working on this to reinvent the wheel or to override anyone's work. Our objective is to better understand disadvantaged communities as engineers, as natural scientists. There is a lot of work done, but there is also a disconnection between the more technical and engineering part of academy and the reality of the communities, of the disadvantaged communities. When there is a problem, it's worse in disadvantaged communities. So everyone has heard about disadvantaged communities. Every once in a while we hear about these places. Sometimes it looks like it's far away, with many socioeconomic problems and environmental injustice. Problems such as water quality, water availability, droughts, floods, air quality, and socioeconomic problems such as lack of opportunities, oppression, lack of representation, racism, poverty. While environmental injustice topics such as air and water quality have been broadly studied, their interconnections with socioeconomic difficulties is less understood. So the truth is that disadvantaged communities experience a disproportionate share of the most pressing challenges, like social, environmental, and economic challenges. And these challenges occur, creating a compounding effect that leads to structural conditions of extreme inequity, extreme inequality, and extreme injustice that are more complex than just the sum of their parts. And we know this is true, but there is not so much richer about the effects of these co-occurring issues and how to solve them. So there is not enough multidisciplinarity and holistic perspectives. So that's why I guess it's reasonable to say that when there is a problem, it's worse in disadvantaged communities, that we have seen it with COVID, for example. And in this picture, this gentleman is from a disadvantaged community near Visalia, and he's filling jugs with water because their well is dry. And here I want to briefly explain why a well in a community runs dry. I guess it's intuitive that when there is not enough water, they will run out of it. I mean, makes sense. But also disadvantaged communities have shallower wells than nearby farms. But to visualize it, I think about this community that is near a farm, and that farm has a well. Let's say it serves 500 acres. It's a regular size for a farm. And they apply 3 acre-feet of groundwater from that well per acre and year. That's about 1 meter of water. And given the rate of research of an aquifer in the Central Valley, that is about 300 millimeters per year, that well needs about this area to recharge every year. So this means that the well is withdrawing water from the aquifer of the community. And in a normal year, if the community is within 1.5 kilometers, this well will be withdrawing water. And in a dry year, it could be up to 2 kilometers. And now imagine that the community is surrounded by agriculture, right? Yeah, it's overdraft without using their own water. And this does not mean that the farmers are to blame for this. The farmers follow the law and the regulation, and yet these circumstances occur. And they occur because the regulation near disadvantaged communities are not good enough, and they are not prioritized. And this is not the farmers' fault. The farmers are the main employers in the region, and most of them are committed to be stewards of their land that is often in their families for generations. But we, the society, push a lot from low prices of food. California farmers have to compete with produce from abroad that does not follow the same strict rules. And the truth is that in the US, we consume everyday products from slavery and from mass destruction of the environment that are practices that are not allowed, obviously, in the United States. But going back to the disadvantaged communities, in this study, we focus on the Central Valley, where the San Joaquin Valley is a hotspot for disadvantaged communities. There is this investigative report of the New York Times that calls the Central Valley a place where flint is everywhere after the famous case of lead contamination in tap water in Flint, Michigan, that affected disproportionately African Americans from socioeconomically depressed areas. And there are more than 2 million people living in disadvantaged communities here in the Central Valley in 467 census tract. That is about 200 communities, of which more than half are severely disadvantaged. So remember that more than 1 million people in the Central Valley don't have reliable access to clean water. But what is a disadvantaged communities? There are 2 definitions, right? The traditional one is a community which median household income is 80% or less than the state's income. And the state's income here is $71,000 per year. Then a disadvantaged community has less than $57,000 per year, per household. And many of them have much less. But we prefer the more extensive definition by the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OIHA, that developed a tool called a CalEnviroscreen that probably many of you are familiar with. A disadvantaged community is an area in the percentile 75 or less or worse, the 75% or more, that is worse, for the CalEnviroscreen index. And here we can take a look at the map. This is Matheny in Tulare County, and this is how they perform. I know it's a lot of information, but you can see indexes related to air quality, water, health, economy, education. And yeah, we can talk about that later, but I would like you now to picture Matheny, right? Matheny, or many disadvantaged communities, in them, their water is contaminated, the air quality is very poor, there are no sidewalks, no parks, no streetlights, the education districts are among the worst in the country, they don't have public transportation, but they do have one thing, they have potholes. Yeah, you can see after a decade, the potholes are still there. They are part of the landscape. There is a report by PolicyLink, which is an institute for advancing racial and economic equity, that details the lack of fundamental features and infrastructure, such as, you guess, safe and affordable drinking water, sewer systems, safe housing, public transportation, parks, sidewalks, streetlights. And those conditions have been reported in the Central Valley in some locations for 1 century. And they still remain in 2020. But going back to this picture, this is Matheny. And at least 10 years ago, they didn't have water security. And now, after years of legal fights in courts against the former mayor of Tulare, they have their water connected to the city, even though they are unincorporated. So this is the result of individual leaders who fought for their communities and are supported by nonprofit organizations such as Leadership Council, Community Water Systems, Self-Enterprises, Clean Water Action. And it's worth mentioning that they pay the same or sometimes even more for their water, but they don't have sewage. They rely on septic tanks and sometimes they empty them in their backyards. And well, that contaminates the community wells. And you may wonder how I know about that. How do I know about that if this is not public information, right? I mean, I know about it because we have went to Matheny several times and to many other communities, and we have asked the community members. So we have conducted about 18 interviews with community leaders and members and advocates from nonprofits and educators, politicians, public servants. And all of them know very, very well the issues that the communities undergo. And in this study, we review and analyze legislation bills, paper news, and scientific articles from 2017 to 2020 with 2 objectives. First, finding out how much representation disadvantaged communities have in California in these 3 platforms. And second, how well those platforms understand the problems, the needs, the concerns occurring in disadvantaged communities. Basically, how well they represent the quality of what is going on there. So again, we brought this because we actually needed to learn about it. And we thought that many other researchers could find this information useful. So we conducted this literature review to find out a framework to address the main aspects of quality of life in disadvantaged communities. And we chose the Regional Opportunity Index, is developed by UC Davis, in combination with some definitions of disadvantaged communities and Cal EPA. The Regional Opportunity Index has only 6 categories, and we call this framework low resolution. Because we also conducted our interviews, about almost 20, and I would say that the interviews were the most important part of all this project, all our research. We have learned so much, and we have used this knowledge from this wisdom, right, from the communities, right, so far for 2 publications, but we plan to use it in many more. So we perform a qualitative and quantitative analysis of the interviews, and we extracted 20 categories that we call high resolution because they are more detailed. And finally, we analyzed the publications from newspaper science and legislation bills using both frameworks. And we considered a corpus with 11,000 bills, 2.6 million newspaper news, and 154,000 scientific publications to analyze representation. And then with the results related only to disadvantaged communities, we conducted the analysis of the quality of the representation based on our interviews, like the low and the high resolution and also the low resolution frameworks. And surprise, I guess it's not, but disadvantaged communities are overwhelmingly underrepresented. So before we started this study, we knew that in California, 9.4 million people, about 25% of the population, live in disadvantaged communities, and 2.1 million, about 40% of the total population of the Central Valley, also live in disadvantaged communities. And it's estimated that about 1 million people don't have water security. And yet in a sample of 154,000 scientific papers regarding California in 4 years, only 68 were about disadvantaged communities. And these results are from Elsevier and Springer. In a sample of 2.6 million newspaper articles, about 1,400 were about communities. And we sampled 240 newspapers, and 91 of them didn't have even one article related to disadvantaged communities. And the mentions, you can see in the figure, the mentions to disadvantaged communities have increased over the last 2 decades, but communities are still overwhelmingly underrepresented. So roughly speaking, just to put a ratio, the ratio to Californians living in disadvantaged communities is 4:1. The ratio of the science and news talking about it is 2,000:1. The ratio of Californians to Californians living without their human right to water, water is a human right in California since 2012, is 50:1. And the ratio of the science and news publications talking about it is 10,000:1. 9 articles in the 154,000 California-related corpus were about disadvantaged communities in the Central Valley, but 0 interviewed residents about environmental justice topics. And again, this is only from Elsevier and Springer. There are other publications that have done a good job about it. This suggests that the scientific community may be assuming what problems the communities have without learning about them or about their reality firsthand. And by assuming what we scientists think the problems are, we are creating a bias that does not help understanding the problems holistically or prioritizes our investigation based on actual needs. There is a gap between most concerns of disadvantaged communities and the representation in media, legislation, and research. These are the results of our interviews. Our analysis of the interviews yielded 20 high-resolution categories, and we did a cluster analysis for the representation in the 3 different platforms, and we obtained 2 distinct clusters, one with more generic categories and the other one with more specific categories. So I know this slide has a lot of information, but it's the quantitative and qualitative analysis of the interview. And I think it's a very, very valuable information also for people who can see the recording afterwards. And in the axis, in the y-axis, you can see the topics raised by the interviewees, and the bars represent the frequency they talked about them. Again, out of 18 interviews. And this is how the publications of these 3 platforms represent the high resolution categories. The generic ones are in more intense colors, describe problems that are relatively well known, such as poor air quality or lack of water access. And the specific ones, however, are problems that are known by most residents and experts, and they experience them in their day by day, but society hardly knows about them. And I will give you an example that will be very clear. So this table represents the representation, the frequency of representation of each topic in the 3 platforms and also in the interviews. And we can see that 94% of the interviewees mentioned problems related to purchasing bottled water and how that was a big problem for them and for their neighbors. And yet hardly any publication talks about it. And it's the same for issues related to inorganic pollutants, pesticides, arsenic or 123 TCP or other heavy metals. It's the same for specific health issues such as valley fever or extreme heat. And I mean, we have a lot of stories. For example, a person told us that 3 people in their family died with valley fever. And I mean, that's not a not well studied health hazard, right? And probably is because only affects low income families in the Central Valley. And it's the same with extreme heat that farm workers have to endure. And this year, besides the extreme heat, farm workers endure also the coronavirus pandemic that affected them disproportionately. And also the wildfires in California. We were, complaining that we cannot walk our dog outside or our cars are dirty with ashes. And they were in the middle of that, in the middle of the pandemic with this toxic air, collecting food for us. And we can go back to Matheny. And this is the example I was giving before. So the kind stakeholders of Matheny, our friends, community leaders and residents opened their doors, opened their houses and told us a lot about them. And we visited Matheny several times. We attended community meetings organized by the Leadership Council where county engineers attended to give updates about the infrastructure the county is going to build in Matheny. And you know what kind of infrastructure? It's, well, sewage. In Matheny, they don't have sewage. Then I read here the drinking water percentile 56. However, in Matheny, they cannot drink or cook with the water from their taps. Some people told us that they have rashes when they shower because their water has a lot of arsenic. And since they don't have sewage, the community wells are contaminated with Escherichia coli, with Giardia, and with Salmonella, because some residents empty their septic tanks instead of have them emptied professionally for $300. And it's this lack of information about the consequences of doing it. And Matheny, they don't have sidewalks, they don't have street lights, they don't have a supermarket, even though there are 4,000 people living there. So they have to buy super expensive in the gas station, or, I mean, if they don't have a car, what are they going to do, right? So honestly, the most realistic percentile here is the PM 2.5 and 99% percentile, because sometimes they are sprayed with pesticides. And they told us that some children had asthma, and when the children left the community, they stopped having asthma. And another person told us that they bleed from their noses when they are sprayed in their house. Then, if these percentiles, I think they are either inaccurate or extremely worrisome if there are so many communities with many more challenging issues than Matheny. And this is another example of how we, scientists or society in general, may be biased when we think about disadvantaged communities. So this is the tap water in the city of San Joaquin in Fresno County, in the west of Fresno County. So sometimes it has a lot of sediments and pollutants. When they open the tap, just black water comes out. And the person who provided this picture said that not everyone in the city had money to purchase bottled water. And then he showed us these videos, pictures. People sent him, videos and pictures every week. And, then, yeah, we asked him, we asked him about the environmental concerns in San Joaquin. And, we were expecting that he would say water, but you know what he said? He said air. And then he said that most people can purchase bottled water, but no one can purchase air. And he took us outside and he showed us his car. It was a nice car, and it was all covered with micro droplets and you touch it, it's like a sandstone, and it's the pesticide drift from the surrounding farm fields. And that person was one of the, I mean, the people who help us the most with our work. And he was very committed with his community, and he was infected with coronavirus, and he died with COVID in July. And it was, yeah, it was very sad, because he was really, really well committed, and he was helping the most vulnerable in his community. And this is just one of the thousands of real stories of disadvantaged communities that go unheard and just forgotten. Well, developing effective policies requires addressing nuances and co-occurrence. And I think education is a good example of the disconnection between the societal perspective of disadvantaged communities and the actual roots of co-occurring problems. This is an example that several stakeholders have given us independently and in different communities. Our questions were very broad. It's like, what are your environmental concerns, socioeconomic concerns? So we didn't direct any questions at all. So some of the schools with the worst performance in the country are in the Central Valley. But education may not improve by bringing the best teachers or state-of-the-art schools with the best teaching technology, because often the root of educational problems is everything but education. And there are several examples: the streets without sidewalks and students without transportation, and that makes the students get wet socks for the whole day when it rains. Very high temperatures that we know in the summer in the Central Valley and also in the fall, and the students don't have air conditioning. Many schools in communities of color don't provide clean water to drink for the kids, so they may be thirsty. Parents that often have more than one job and they cannot devote times to their kids, and that is a lack of motivation for the children. Parents who don't speak English, so they cannot help the children with their homework. There are no green areas or parks, so the children cannot see this connection between humans and nature that sparks the natural curiosity and to learn. And parents with economic problems, sometimes they have to choose between paying rent and paying water bills and buying bottled water or feed their children properly. And many other problems that are not easy to address just with standardized methods or tests or surveys. So education performance may be poor, but it's not a problem. It's a consequence of many other problems. And I tell you, I have seen firsthand that some of these kids are brilliant, and you know, their teachers are devoted to them. So it's not on them, it's on the rest of the things. Community-specific knowledge is necessary to advance sustainable, effective solutions. And with this, I arrive to the conclusions. And as conclusions, communities suffer from intertwined problems that must be addressed altogether. Current approaches to solve disadvantaged communities' problems are insufficient and sometimes out of focus. Intentions do not solve problems, and policies have to be closely enforced. On a positive side, there are examples with good outcomes. For example, this new electric trucks bill that will decrease a lot the PM 2.5 emissions near disadvantaged communities. And current approaches can identify large-scale problems, like low-resolution approaches are good for that. And of course, many scientists, journalists, and legislators are willing to contribute with their work to improve the quality of life of the community members. And our recommendations are that to succeed, media must increase representation of disadvantaged communities and amplify their voices. Legislators must serve adequately the communities, listening and allocating enough resources. And scientists must study the communities more rigorously, must stop assuming the problems that affect them, and bring more multidisciplinary and holistic research and more broader perspective with the intent to serve them. And The community-based research has helped us a lot with this. We have learned so much from stakeholders. We think all the scientists would benefit a lot from this kind of community-based research. And finally, I want to talk very briefly about the guide we are just published with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I'm happy that we brought it in English and in Spanish, because then my mom and my dad can also read it in Spanish, even though they don't live in the Central Valley. And the Union of Concerned Scientists has published both versions in October. And that is distributed in the communities by community members and also by nonprofits that work with them. And of course, if any of you want to distribute the guide among your contacts, please contact me and I will send you, or we will send you copies in paper, the copies that you need. But also, if you want access to the guide, you can go online and just Google Union of Concerned Scientists Guide, Climate Change, San Joaquin, and it should appear very quickly. And in brief, the intention of this guide is to provide information and ideas to community members regarding climate change and what they can do about it. We created this guide based on the concerns from disadvantaged community members, and they also help us to review the guide afterwards, to review the language, and they shared some pictures to improve the clarity. Originally, we were planning and focusing on water, but then we realized that we need to talk more about more topics such as air quality, economic opportunities, and other topics. This guide is designed for everyone, so especially for disadvantaged communities. So we have tried to be very inclusive and very clear in our communication, and we have diagrams that are very clear. So I think it's very transparent. And we want this to be a dynamic project. We are creating a web version of the guide with the concerns and the community, the science can be updated. And this is how it looks like. Yeah, so it has different sections, an introduction to each section, the community concerns raised by the stakeholders, by the community, and how those concerns are likely to be impacted by climate change. And lastly, each section has some ideas for adaptation strategies that goes from very basic things like fixing leaks or hydrate when it's very hot and dry, to advocacy activities and phone numbers and agencies to call to report water quality issues or air quality issues or any violations of their fundamental rights. And with this, I want to thank you again. If you have any questions, maybe we can talk about them now.
Engel, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna say that I am shocked, but I'm not surprised, as you rightly said. So we all have work to do. So I'm just gonna, so if you have questions, just put them in the chat, because we're not supposed to record anyone who is non-UC. So write that in the chat and I will read it out. So I think the first question is, how is an economics solution defined? And this is related to your Sigma solutions.
Yeah, so all the solutions and all the stakeholders are defined with keywords, and we look for those keywords in the different newspaper news. And I mean, we do that with NVivo, and I don't know if you know NVivo, but basically we encode the articles at the paragraph level, and each paragraph may have several keywords, and these keywords classify that paragraph and then that article as containing economic solutions or the other types of solutions.
So this may include water trading or land retirement, paying for land retirement and things of that nature?
It may. I mean, I would need to check all the keywords, but yes, probably yes.
Okay.
Maybe incentives too. I mean, yeah, I should check.
Okay, the next question is, as you mentioned, there is an insidious connection where many DUCs, meaning disadvantaged communities, have limited opportunities outside of agriculture, while agricultural activity also degrades water quality and accessibility. Can you speak a bit about how this coupled feedback loop can be interrupted or how to improve the harmony between the agriculture systems and workers who live in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of one of our projects. We are trying to create or propose a framework to create buffers surrounding disadvantaged communities. That it's something that has been proposed previously. But in this case, we don't want just to retire the land. We also want to bring to this retired agricultural land new opportunities for agricultural industry or for solar panels or for, I mean, green areas, wildlife. So this would benefit the stakeholders, the owners of the land, because it would bring like new development for them, but also would bring new opportunities for the communities, right? This is just a framework we are working right now. We hope we can publish a paper about it next semester, but I think it's totally possible. I mean, you talk to farmers and they don't want to do wrong things. It's just, it's a consequence of the structure of the system, right? So I think we can all work together to improve that system. And for example, bringing opportunities to the communities would help reducing environmental injustice and socioeconomic depression, but would also provide opportunities for those who own the land, you know, the farmers or future industry and society, environment.
Thank. The next question is related to your journal articles analyzed. Were those restricted to certain disciplines, or were like all journals that you can find in given?
Yeah, all the journals contain in Elsevier any topic. We were looking for keywords in them, and that was our filter. And then we read the articles, of course. But it was basically all the journals in Elsevier from the time frame for almost 4 years, and all the journals in Springer. That's probably about half of the scientific production.
Yeah, so those were all the questions in the chat, and now I have a question that I would really want to ask. What is the role of UC, in particular the UC A&R, with the responsibility of doing the extension and engaging the community? You kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I'm just wondering if you have more thoughts and have at least some instruction for us. Like, I mean, how can we do our job better and be more impactful and engaging?
Well, I think you are in a wonderful position to do a lot, right? And I mean, I think you are also doing, right? So we talked with Sam Sandoval last week. We recorded a podcast with him, and it's also in the same lines, right? How can we do this? It's not like we have a solution for everyone. I mean, we have started doing this recently. I think going to the communities, engage with the stakeholders, ask them, you know, we can learn so many things, and we have a totally different perspective from them. And many of them are like super smart and very well educated, and they are people who believe in that they can change and they can improve their community. So they go out, they study, and they come back, and they become like, you know, small politicians or business owners that could live in Fresno or in LA or whatever, but they prefer to go to their small community. And they, you know, I think those are very, very inspiring for us, and you can learn so much from them. And I think conducting interviews was enlightening for us. I think just it's not I can give you a solution. I think you have to go and ask them, and you will find a solution with them. I mean, but if I have to tell you something is, you can continue the work you do and these infographics and be like your outreach to be more extensive, but to produce the outreach, I think, humbly, I think that talking to the communities is extremely, extremely useful. And this community-based participatory research is totally necessary if you want to work with them.
Yeah, I know we are over time, but I want to give at least some time for Ellen or David if they have any closing thoughts or questions.
I mean, this was awesome, Angel. I feel like totally inspired. So thank you so much for sharing all this work. It's awesome.
I am trying to you know, to channel the inspiration I have for from the communities. You know, some members were just amazing. Like, you know, it's amazing. Like people who have been working, fighting for their community for 10, 20 years, and they don't have so much, but they give everything. You know, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So, Fika, I know you're over. This is David Lewis. I just would like to, again, thank Angel. This is just amazing work and really eye-opening for all of us to think about not only how to do it, but what you've learned. On the how to do it side, I'd like you to share a little more about navigating and at least starting with the low resolution opportunity index when that's the best you can do for your first start. You know, back to your original, the way you started this talk was, how do you do this work? Well, we don't know. We just know we need to. So
Yes.
Can you help us think about that a little more?
Yeah, so again, I come back to saying that there is amazing work done by social scientists, and some of them are at UC Davis, and they have developed this regional opportunity index. But there are other indexes, and there's a lot of literature in the social science that can help us understanding better the framework. You know, the framework that you can face when you go there. But I think the most important thing that we have learned is that you cannot solve problems in disadvantaged communities if you treat all the communities as if they were the same, because they may have problems with water quality, and sometimes those problems with water quality is because they don't have enough water, and then the concentration of the pollutants raises, or the contaminants, and sometimes is because they have legacy of 1,2,3 TCP from 20 years ago and is contaminating, you know, or sometimes it's organic pollutants. So it's not that you can solve air problems or water problems with the same tools. So you need to go there and understand that. So I think the good thing from this low resolution perspective, I mean, and if you go to the regional opportunity index, you have like a lot of subsections, right? But I think the good thing of the broader framework is that you can find more or less where what the problems are, and then you can focus on understanding them and at a better level. But it's not that you can do something that will solve everything. You need to go there and you need to learn firsthand and solve each case, I mean, almost each case separately, right?
Okay, with that, thank you everyone for joining. We will be off in December and we'll return to the webinar series back in the new year. So hope to see you again next year. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.